But now I'm going to actually, we're still in South Africa, as a matter of fact, because our next presenter is really still in South Africa. Dr. Bob Wekesa is the director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of the Witwatersrand, Wits, South Africa. He has a Masters and Ph.D. from the Commonwealth University, from the Communication University of China. Dr. Wekesa is an interdisciplinary scholar of international media and communications, foreign policy, and diplomacy. His areas of specialization include Africa China, Africa US, Africa Gulf states, and Africa in the world topics. Dr. Wekesa is the author of numerous publications, including books, book chapters, academic journals, newspaper commentary, and policy papers. He is a frequent commentator on current affairs on radio, podcasts, and television shows globally. His latest publication is China's Footprints in East Africa, Pessimism and Optimism. I should say that I've worked with Dr. Wekesa on numerous projects and really is a wonderful, wonderful colleague. So welcome, Dr. Wekesa, all the way from Johannesburg, South Africa. And we have your PowerPoint already up, and please take it up.
Is everybody able to see it?
Is everybody able to see? I can see it.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Thank you very much, Agnes, and thank you very much, colleagues, for giving me this opportunity. And I am definitely going to learn as much as I share the little I know about this topic. And it is also great that I'm coming after a colleague in the media space, because that's my original home in terms of profession and disciplinary interests. As mentioned there, I'm from the African Center for the Study of the United States. But I think picking off from where my colleague Will stopped, one notes that the platform that he and other colleagues run is called Africa is a Country. And that is an interesting starting point, because even when you think of the topic I'm speaking to, the role of African universities in advancing innovation, one wants to imagine it from a continental perspective, meaning similarities that speak to Africa is a country. So in a sense, most African universities share certain uniqueness, peculiarities, characteristics, and traits. But at the same time, different countries and different universities and different institutions and different parts of different regions of the continent have different university ecologies. And so as I share this perspective, it is not feasible to cover the entire continent in terms of its university landscape and how that links into innovation. I think we can go to the next slide. So one has to start with the point that when we think of African universities, we are talking of a very long arc. I want to imagine that colleagues on the call will identify the picture in this slide. Even when we stretch it, and I know many colleagues in the university, scholarship, higher education domain will tell you that their understanding of a university is more expansive than the Westphalian or the Western notion of a bound institution and so forth. So many of a good number of scholars will tell you the universities in the home, the universities in the marketplace, the universities in social interactions, and so forth. I think we can proceed to the next slide, and that will tell us a bit about that image. That image is one of the structures called the buildings that exists today. It's in Timbuktu, Mali. And so we see that some will imagine that universities in Africa started only after independence of African countries, mostly in the 60s, in the 1960s. But this university has been in existence since 982 Christian era. And as we know, for colleagues particularly familiar with West Africa and the Sahel region, we had this massive civilization. At some point, in fact, we mentioned one of the leaders of this civilization, Mansa Musa, was considered the wealthiest man in the world. And so he will give people like Elon Musk his heels if he was alive today. And as part of the wealth created in this vast Songhai kingdom, current Mali mostly, Mali, the country in West Africa, but spreading over other parts of West African Sahel. So I think this is just to sensitize us to the fact that universities have been around on the continent in structural form for many years. But the understanding of universities, in fact, if you look at some of the other colleagues who have weighed in on this, is more expansive than the normative Western understanding. I think going on, I think I picked up on these two particular, just go back to the previous slide, please. No, I think the first slide first. I wanted to mention that University of Al Qarawiyyin in Morocco is equally from 859 AD, a long time back. It was, in fact, it was a center for scholars coming from Europe, from places like France and Southern Europe. Al-Azhar University in Egypt dates back to 972 AD. Fura Bay College, which is now the University of Sierra Leone. And of course, Sierra Leone, as we know, is a settlement of African Americans, formerly enslaved Americans. It's been around since 1827. University of Cape Town, which is actually a leading university of the continent, has been around since 1829, and it was essentially associated with the English immigrants or colonizers for that matter, who were based in the Cape province, now known as Western Cape, from 1829. I think we can proceed to the next slide. Okay, so I think the other point one can make when just looking at this slide is that in the 1900s, most of the institutions that were set up on the continent, save for a few, particularly in South Africa, came with the Dutch immigrants who are now called Afrikaners. A few of those have made their way to the US in recent times. So they set up institutions such as Stellenbosch, and of course, I'll mention here that there's been difficulties in South African universities, particularly universities such as Stellenbosch, which are seen as too white and too racist and too segregated. But anyhow, this is, Stellenbosch University, 1903, 1903, Cairo University of Egypt, 1908. And when you go down to University of Fort Hare, it has been around since 1916. And this is an important institution because it's the university that trained some of the top leaders on the continent, including Nelson Mandela. He did a stint there before he went to University of Witwatersrand. Robert Gabriel Mugabe also is alumni there, and a few others. Now, interestingly, the Americans, who I think I should say is you folks, have been around also the continent university-wise, because the American University in Cairo was set up in 1919 as part of American interest in the Suez Canal, which exists to date. Okay, next slide. So continuing on, in the 1900s, we had Makerere University in Uganda, established in 1922. If you ask colleagues from Makerere, they always tell you that we are the #1 university, and until you look at other data and statistics, but it was then known as University of East Africa, with colleges in campuses in Nairobi, which eventually became University of Nairobi, for engineering and STEM related subjects. And in Dar es Salaam, there was School of Law. And of course, these institutions, Makerere University in its formative years and later on also trained some of the first political, academic, business, global leaders in the region. And then my institution here, I didn't put the year, but University of Witwatersrand was equally established in 1922, but it had started way back in 1896 as a mines college in the city of Kimberley, where the diamond mining started. University of Ghana, 1948, University of Ibadan, 1948 too, and University of Zimbabwe in 1952. One point one has to mention for all these institutions that you see that they were closely tied to missionaries coming over into the continent. Many of the lecturers and scholars there were missionaries. It was also tied to imperialism because, as you see, universities such as University of Witwatersrand was essentially established as part of training for mining experts. And that's why, in fact, many of these universities, such as University of Witwatersrand and others, have a very strong focus on the engineering, be it civil or mechanical and so forth. I think we can proceed. And I think to the earlier slide, I may just conclude, what one learns is that this is a form of colonial innovation, and some of it has carried on. In the case of University of Zimbabwe that I mentioned earlier, the English had, decided or determined that Zimbabwe was going to be an English colony forever. And therefore, in setting up the institution, they were to train particularly farming communities. This is large scale, farming on grabbed land and so forth. Yeah, so I shared this slide, this picture of Wits University for where I'm based, basically, where the African Center for the Study of the United States is based. Because if you look at the architecture of the building, right in the center there, you realize that its design is on the basis of universities such as Oxford, London School of Economics and so forth. This architecture is actually evident around the continent in the earlier universities. And I think this then provides some kind of background information for us all. I think we can proceed. So when you look at universities on the continent, you realize that they're quite a big number, actually. The US, by some statistics as well, over 2,000 universities, I would imagine. The continent on its entirety has 2,389 universities, according to the Association of African Universities, and the increase has been rapid. This is in 2023. The number is definitely has expanded because I know that new universities have been set up in places such as Zambia, Tanzania, Kenya, in Nigeria, and so forth. In fact, the trend lately has been that while universities used to be public universities, that is government supported, there's also an uptick in private institutions set up by religious organizations or as businesses, or universities that set up by a consortium of interested parties. So definitely the number today is higher than 2,389. And there's quite a rapid growth in the numbers across the continent. But in specific terms, looking at Nigeria as a macrocosm, of course, Nigeria is the most populous country on the continent. As of last year, it had 270 universities. And again, I'm just mentioning this to say that it looks like, as part of innovation, as part of growth, African universities in Africa are going to expand. If you look at Nigeria, for example, which is the case with many other African countries, some of the new universities have splintered from original universities or universities that had other campuses dealing with various disciplines. I will tell you, for example, that in Makerere University in Uganda that I mentioned earlier, now has universities such as Kiamboko, which used to be College of Education. And there's been that movement there. And then, of course, the number of students, university students in Nigeria in 2019 was nearly 500,000. That number has increased meteorically. In fact, I was looking at the figures today, and there's over 1 million students in university institutions, meaning that, again, the expansion of universities, both in numbers within universities and the growth in the number of universities themselves, is a function of enrollment and the demand for higher education in Nigeria, which is, as I'm mentioning here, a microcosm of call it Seychelles or Burundi or DRC and so forth. So Nigeria, as of last year, 2023, had 36 state universities with government control of 62. 147 were essentially private universities, from just 3 in 1999. And one can go on and on about private universities in Nigeria. Suffices to mention the Pan-Atlantic University, which has one of the leading business schools in Lagos. It also has a media school in Lekki, which is a neighborhood of Lagos. And so I think we want to underline the fact that private universities are on the rise, and so forth. I think we can proceed. So in terms of rankings of African universities, I just wanted to share this slide as a demonstration of the inequalities when it comes to performance. Globally, only University of Cape Town, and this is a critique of African universities really, only University of Cape Town is in the up to 200 band of universities globally. It is at number 65. And I'm using just one matrix times higher education rankings. And even as I say this, I think I want to point out that there have been also critiques of these rankings, on the basis of what they rank, how they do the ranking, lack of consideration of certain factors and so forth. But nonetheless, if it is a bellwether into how universities perform on a global scale, even with the critique, one can see that universities in Africa then fall behind their global partners, particularly North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, particularly China. You see that Stellenbosch, which is number 2 on the continent according to Times Higher Education, is in the 300 to 350 band. University of Witwatersrand is in the same category. Then we have Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in the 400 to 500, and University of Johannesburg also in that category. I think it's very striking here to say now we have looked at inequalities between African and global universities and their counterparts elsewhere in the world, but also the inequalities in the continent itself. Very easily, South African universities claim the top spot in most of the rankings. In fact, if we went on beyond the 5 universities listed here, you'll see that University of KwaZulu-Natal, University of Pretoria, University of Free State, all of them in South Africa kind of rise to the top. With a spangling of other African universities, like sometimes Ibadan in Nigeria, sometimes Makerere, universities such as University of Nairobi in Kenya fall far behind. Many of the universities really, in terms of these rankings, then are not faring well. And that's a question that one poses in terms of what innovative approaches can be undertaken to redress this in some form or shape. I think we can proceed. Now, coming to university associations, one of the things and organizations on the continent, one realizes that there are quite a number that are continental in nature. The leading one is the Association of African Universities. And in fact, the Association of African Universities has done well because it has broken the language and country barriers so much so that you have Lusophone speaking universities in there, such as Modland University in Mozambique, or universities in Angola, and Francophone countries. It has representation in North America. In fact, it has a North America chapter based in the US. And it is an association that brings together all universities to think together around funding, curriculum, exchanges, intra-Africa, and so forth. I think I was also sharing this so that if you want to look up a resource, their website is regularly updated and provides many tidbits, information, and so forth. I think we can proceed to the next slide. I'm sharing this quite a busy slide because Codesria is, which is based in Dakar, Senegal, is one of the major, inter-Africa organization dealing with things to do with innovation and so forth. One of on this particular slide, we see that they have an ongoing innovation seed fund, which is in partnership with Oxford University Africa Society. And basically what this initiative does is that it kind of issues calls where students with brilliant ideas in agriculture or in tech, digital technologies, or in matters to do with infrastructure development, the engineering fields, and so forth. And this is just one of the initiatives. So that even as we think of Africa globally contributing only a very small percentage, I think the figure might be less than 5% of R&D globally. There are such initiatives, and some of them are undertaken with other global partners, in this case, Oxford in the UK. We can proceed. Then, of course, the other association that I'll mention is that of African Research Universities Alliance, which is based in Ghana, Accra, Ghana, at University of Ghana, Legon, and administratively also managed from here, University of Witwatersrand. Now, this is a bit of an exclusive, entity, and because it only includes research-intensive universities. These are about 20 or so of them. In Nigeria, for instance, it includes University of Lagos, better known simply as Unilag, Ibadan, Makerere, Nairobi, University of Dar es Salaam, and so forth. Now, the thing with this particular association is that it is small, well managed, and it has done well over a short period of time in terms of funding brilliant, excelling research entities, usually from master's or PhD dissertations, or practical work, particularly for the natural sciences. And some of this is actually undertaken in partnership with corporate organizations. I could mention MTN, which is a large mobile telephony company, telecommunication company on the continent, which supports some of these initiatives. And I think, as we shall see in the next slide, which we can move to, there's quite a bit of involvement of these associations, in fact, all these organizations. And one of the testing period for African universities' involvement in the innovation was during COVID-19, when vaccine development became an important and urgent matter. In this particular case, ARUA, or African Research Universities Alliance, partnered with the African Union. And I must mention that the African Union also does have the Pan-African University, which is a model where the AU has campuses in selected what they call centers of excellence, and where it partners with UNESCO, for funding for some of the research projects. I think we can proceed. Okay, I think I did mention earlier the Council for Development of Social Science and Research in Africa, CODESRIA, which celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2023. This is a particularly excellent, long-running university level organization. As I mentioned, it's based in Dakar, Senegal, and it has excelled because it also brings together Francophone, Anglophone, African universities, and it has quite been heavily involved in matters to do with research and innovation. One of the more recent projects that we have seen them roll out is development or enhancement of indigenous medicine, which was tied to a project they had on indigenous knowledge in universities. And it has also been associated with some of the leading, scholars on the continent for many, many years. So it is kind of Codestria started off with these polemical approaches to knowledge for its own sake, kind of ivory tower vision. But it has, over the years, now transitioned into the innovation space, particularly across STEM subjects, while retaining the fundamental philosophical issues of what is education and what should education do in social and democratic development. I think we can proceed to the next slide. I'm sharing here again one of the initiatives which speaks to partnerships. Codestria again has partnered with MasterCard in terms of call for papers. Of course, we know that MasterCard is a Canadian philanthropy. It has quite a large footprint on the continent. And the focus there again has been what are the new ideas that African students are coming up with? How can they be incubated? And how can they then be developed into products? And I think some of us from the social sciences and humanities will cringe at the idea that you want to convert an idea into a product, because, we are more attuned to knowledge for knowledge's sake, or basically the understanding and comprehension of theories and concepts and so forth. We used to talk of praxis, which is the link between theory and practice. And I think that is increasingly happening in the form of calls such as this that are geared towards development of indigenous knowledge, in this particular call, for example, into something that can be tangible. As I mentioned earlier, development of medicines, so that we don't do concoctions in our villages, but maybe we can convert those into medicines that can be, be of pharmaceutical level value. Okay. Oh, I think we lost out on some slides. Okay, I think there might be a challenge with the slides, but I will just proceed to go to the next level of discussion. And sorry for that. I will mention that the whole area of partnerships is interesting to consider because, as mentioned earlier, there's a lot of collaboration between universities and corporate organizations. I'm thinking, for example, in Makerere, Uganda, where recently students actually came up with an innovation of a bus. This is for transport in partnership with the Uganda Manufacturers Association. This is an example of partnership with the corporate world for innovation. I'll also mention in Kenya the example of a bank called Equity Bank, which has had for nearly 15 years now an innovation which takes Kenyan students to the US to learn, to gain expertise in various industry domains. It's called Wings to Fly, if you want to remember it, Wings to Fly. And then the understanding is that students will then come back to Kenya or any part of East Africa to implement the ideas they have gained over the years of study in the US. Now, this is, and I think we could go on and on. Tony Elumelu in Nigeria has similar initiative. I mean, the Tony Elumelu Foundation. We have, Patrice Mosepe, who is one of the industrialists here in South Africa, equally has a fund to support students interested in innovation and working on various projects. Now, if you move on, the partnerships with organizations, governments, institutions outside of the continent. I think the three key ones for African universities will be US Africa, higher education innovations. Now, as we all know, the US administration in around 2018 or so initiated something called University Partnerships Initiative. This University Partnerships Initiative was delivered of the quick results out of that. As an example was, for example, Carnegie Mellon University establishing a campus in Rwanda, which is running up to today, focused on digital technologies more specifically. But such examples now are very rare. I mean, since January 20, when we had the big inauguration in Washington, D.C., because some of the funds that went into that, including Fulbright funding, including for African scholars or scholars in the US looking to do work here, that has been terminated, and therefore that looks a bit shaky. Now, that's not about it from the US, because specific universities in the US also have partnerships that are geared towards innovation in one form or another. An example will be the African Agricultural Partnerships, which is an initiative at the Michigan State University, and it works with the partner universities in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi, specifically in agriculture, everything from development of seeds to preparation of land for farming to adhering to matters to do with environment and so forth. I think that will be one example. The other example, of course, that helps with innovation is the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship Program. And I want to note that Howard University is a partner in this. This is an initiative that was started by a scholar originally from Malawi, now at Howard. It's called Paul Seleza. And basically what this initiative does is that it allows time for African immigrants in the higher education sector who are based at US institutions to come over to the continent and engage in research with their fellow faculty members, with students and so forth. It has had a good track record because it started in the 2010s. It is still running. It's supported by the Carnegie Foundation program. Then I think one can go on to corporate America and its involvement in innovation on the continent. I think a good example will be Strathmore University, I think two actually, Strathmore University and Pan-Atlantic University, which basically work with American Chamber of Commerce, which of course is a collection of American Chamber of Commerce Africa, that is, a collection of American enterprises, businesses that work on the continent. They do very practical learning activities such as providing internships for students, particularly from schools of business, to have some practical experience in these institutions. I think then of course there are other creative initiatives such as the one long-running one from the 1950s called Africa American Institute. It's based in New York. It has been involved in equally placement of African students into American institutions, but also placement in corporations, American or otherwise, African, so that when students graduate with certain skill sets, they match them with businesses that might have skill set shortages in particular domains, in particular departments of their work. I think in a nutshell, the recent turn in the US means that partnerships at the government-to-government level have almost plummeted. And in fact, I've not even mentioned, businesses such as Microsoft, Google, and so forth that have been involved in setting up digital labs at the University of Cape Town, at UNILAG, at Addis Ababa University, and so forth. But it will appear that government-to-government partnerships that will help advance Africa's innovation really have suddenly come to a sudden standstill. In fact, it's worse than that, because with the recent ban, suspension of issuance of visas, many of the students who are geared to go to the US, and increasingly this will be students from the STEM fields, basically are not going to travel, or are in a precarious situation, because we are speaking of being in June and the fall semester is really around the corner. I think one can also speak to European partnerships with the European partners. The British Council has an entrepreneurship program that has been running for nearly 5 years. It encourages students to make proposals, develop their ideas, and take them to the market. Again, marketization of ideas. And this is the pilot program was in South Africa. It's actually ongoing, it's coming to an end in South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, and one more that I think it's Ethiopia for that matter. Then, of course, the European Union has something called Erasmus Mundus, which is an exchange program equally focused particularly on issues to do with climate change. What are some of the innovative ideas to stem things like flooding, carbon credits, and so forth? I think the big new entrant into African innovative space are the Chinese, because by 2020, the Chinese had actually surpassed the United States and France as the leading provider of scholarships to the continent. And many of the students going there are going to do aeronautics, things to do with big data, and it's all across. The estimation as of now is that well over 100,000 students from the African continent have gone to Chinese universities to learn. And of course, many of them have returned on the continent. In fact, the idea is that you study in China and come back. The Chinese have used their entities such as Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the China-Africa Joint Research Program, and of course, their companies to deliver this scholarship. Every 3 years, through the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, there's a very clear and distinct action plan on university exchanges. What has happened through this is that increasingly you see China-Africa university partnerships, usually with a presence on campus. One of the other tools that has been used, and of course this then ties into innovation, because the Chinese come with Chinese professors, scholars, and so forth, come and work with their counterparts on finding real solutions to issues, particularly in the issues of digital technologies, as I mentioned, in infrastructure development and so forth. The innovative approach that the Chinese have also used in this journey towards innovation has been establishment of Confucius Institutes. There used to be only a handful on the continent. Now it is 60 plus and counting. So in a sense, the Chinese now are the top partners for African countries in terms of partnerships that then develop towards innovations. Okay, now I think further afield, and I believe I should be coming to a close. One can also point out the fact that in addition to the idea that private universities are increasingly becoming more important, one characteristic of why private universities on the continent are increasingly attractive is that they are smaller, they are more focused, they are exclusive, they are for parents who can afford fees. What then has happened is that public universities, which are crowded, our university is a public university, it has 40,000 students. And this is the case with a good number of other universities. Countries are facing economic downtowns and therefore unable to provide resources for public universities. So we have a situation where increasingly innovation happens in private institutions, while the kind of non-innovative education goes to public universities. I think the second other aspect that one can point out is that there's a rise in specialty universities. South Africa is a good example, but this is across the continent. The universities that are just fully focused on medicine, for example, the universities of technology, we have Durban University of Technology, we have similar universities across the continent. We have a situation where, because of the high demand, the African continent has a median age of 19.5 years. Nearly 60% of the population is youth. And therefore, there's a huge demand for higher education. And so what has happened, which has had a negative consequence, is that some of the middle-level colleges that were set up to provide practical skills, such as polytechnics, are now being converted into universities in some of the countries, which then denies lower level, students that might not have attained grades to join universities an opportunity to acquire skills that can be useful in other ways. I think I'll stop here and entertain any questions going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. This was a great follow-up to our first presentation this morning in terms of, looking at formal education and when he looked at informal education. And please raise your hand so that I can actually see you and ask you to turn on your cameras and engage with our presenter this morning. While you're doing that, I will kick off by asking a question. Okay, that's Calvin Murray. You just raise your hand. Please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question.
Okay,
Calvin?
thanks so much.
Yes.
Yes, thanks so much. I would like to ask here a few questions concerning the presentations. First of all, the presentation was very good, and I've come to know the history of many universities in Africa. But there are some of the things that we are not doing compared to other universities in European countries. As you can see, we have a lot of initiatives, we have a lot of collaboration in research, and but we miss some of the very few things concerning something like the Erasmus exchange program in Africa. So we don't have such thing in Africa, and you may find that sometimes we don't have enough fund to facilitate such actions. I don't know what will be the way forward to get there as European countries.
Thank you. Bob, you want to
Right.
take that?
Should I respond? Yeah, no, certainly. I think one trend that has emerged over the years in terms of African university collaboration is that while we have these coordinating bodies, such as the Association of African Universities, we are seeing recoiling, or basically the lack of coordination between African universities in terms of intra-Africa exchanges. I think those of us who went to university in the 90s or even earlier will recall that, in fact, in many African universities, you had the scholars from other countries. So if you are a Kenyan, you had a professor from Nigeria, another one from South Africa, another one from Zambia or whatever. But I think pressures of the pressure of university jobs as jobs has meant that many of these positions now are given to citizens of our country rather than expanding that. And I think this relates to the question because many African countries have looked internally and tightened the grip on universities rather than exchanges, as in the case of Erasmus Mundus or Chinese Scholarship Council or Fulbright and so forth. I think the other factor is that increasingly, we must admit this, African universities have underperformed, and many African scholars have decided then to go abroad, so that the brightest minds, including in the STEM fields, but in just every discipline, are now to be found in universities in the UK, in Germany, in the US, in Australia, and other places. I think this ties to the fact that then we have so much to learn from others other than learning from ourselves. One of the proposals, therefore, would be if the AAU, Association of African Universities, CODESRI, and so forth, could figure out an exchange program that is fully intra-Africa. And I'm saying this, in fact, with understanding that even in South Africa itself, which is an intellectual power of the continent, appreciation of scholars and students from other countries sometimes quickly faces xenophobic attitudes. So I think it's a good question, Calvin, and it's a tough one. I think it requires a mind shift for us to start saying.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Right. I have a question for you, Bob, as well. So you related to the fact that, the continent is the youngest, in terms of the population, having the youngest population. So the question is, what are the universities doing to transform how they actually view higher education and relate it to what is needed on the ground? And related to that, you touched on that very briefly, but the issue of community colleges. This was the bedrock for most, universities, most countries after independence. What is the status of that? And could that serve as a way of engaging those students that actually, the younger generation, and just also relating that to what is required in the industry?
Thanks, Agnes. To the first question, of course, these are interlinked questions. The one sliver of optimism is that increasingly African universities are centering what they call decolonized education or decolonial education in their curriculum. And one will recall that the drive towards a decolonized education, meaning an education that is not too hierarchical, where students are considered partners rather than people to be looked down upon, that students actually also contribute their ideas into curriculum development, teaching, feedback, quality, assessments, and so forth. So I think that's one. And of course, this came around after the Feast Must Fall kind of movement in South Africa, which spread to other countries. I think a related example that is making policymakers and university administrators, higher education administrators, is an incident that clearly happened in Kenya and Senegal. In Kenya, there was a Gen Z revolution of last year, where basically the young people kind of overturned government institutions and shook up things. In the aftermath of that, there was a talk of using education as a means of providing jobs, employment for young people, with a particular focus on digital technologies. I think in the case of Senegal, going to the elections in 2023, there were similar. In fact, there were quite some negative instances in that students burned down one of the libraries, one of the main universities there, leading to the election of a very youthful leader, one of the most youthful of the continent currently. So I think there's a recognition that the youth bulge, we used to talk of youth bulge as a time bomb. I think it has arrived. And countries are struggling to figure out what we do with demographics of, in many countries, youth being over 50% of the population. And I think the tech world it becomes very important as a potential entry because the youth are innovative, they are nimble, they are born with the internet, and like most of us who learned how to type or whatever, do work with computers later in life. I think that's one point. And of course, then that digital technologies, including AI, are cross-cutting. They apply across many fields. I think I did mention the idea of the hunger for university education on the continent leading to the end of community colleges. This is a phenomenon across the continent. I think many policymakers were of the misguided view that because many students want to go into university, they'd rather upgrade polytechnics, community colleges that provided practical skills like in agriculture, like farming, in simple things like carpentry and masonry and plumbing and so forth. So much so that now most countries are actually revising the curriculums to go back to the same thing that they kind of had, watered down or just, removed from the education system. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any, Elsa? Oh, Elsa, my colleague, has raised her hand. Go ahead, Elsa.
I'll just be very brief. I want to thank you so much, Bob, for this great presentation. I've learned so much, and African universities are not often talked about. I want to underline something that you said, and hear you maybe speak about it very briefly because I know we're running out of time, is the study for the African study for the African Center for the Study of the United States is an amazing shift in perspective. The United States is not used to being studied, right? Africa has been studied, and it's been there's been a history of domination around that. So I'm curious to hear you briefly talk about the Center for the Study of the United States.
Right. I think you've said I summarize, and I'll attempt to do that. Essentially, this center was established in 2018 here at Wits with exactly what you've said, that in our academic work, we cite lots of American scholars. I myself have always cited a scholar called Joseph Nye of soft power, who passed on recently. And in almost every field, that will be the case. We realized that there was a skewed asymmetrical relationship at the intellectual level alone. But we also kind of understood the US only through Hollywood, music and film and so forth, which is quite ephemeral. We realized that as Africans, we don't understand America as a global power, America as a society, America geographically. If you talked of where is Nebraska or Omaha, to someone in my village, they will be like, oh, you mean there's a village like that in South Africa? And so we thought we'll go that direction. Quite interestingly, as we embarked on that journey in 2018, the people who were most interested in our center were African studies centers rather than American studies centers, because essentially we wanted to do American studies. So we have had to revise that a bit to include both aspects of what you will call an American studies degree or project with Africa-US relations, which is a slightly different focus. We were fortunate enough to have been provided funding by the Ford Foundation to help start such similar centers elsewhere on the continent. So currently we have another African Center for the Study of the US at University of Pretoria, at University of Nairobi, Makerere University, and we are on the cusp of establishing two more in West Africa, essentially Pan-Atlantic University and University of Ghana. One of the programs that has really been exciting and which is becoming almost the core of our activities, both here and in the other universities that are now starting to focus on the US, to study the US, is exchanges. Many colleagues from whether historically Black colleges and universities, or Ivy League universities, or community colleges and so forth, are very much interested to visit various African countries on exchange programs, on summer schools, on study abroad programs, and related matters. So, and of course, sometimes
Bob,
they are.
I will take, thank you, Bob. I will take one more last question, related to, Chumani has just raised his hand, and I just want to see if you can just respond to that as well. Chumani, could you just make your question very brief and, so that Bob can address it? I know we're getting close to the end of our first session.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks very much, Bob, for your presentation. I'm just interested, Bob, on the idea. I think there has been, of course, our seminar today, it's about what is happening in the African classroom, right? And as far as the South African question in relation to the African question of education, right? You've said something about the xenophobia that seems to be taking place. There seems to me that there is this lack of critical engagement with this question of xenophobia in South Africa, right? What sometimes I would like to call it as Afrophobia as opposed to xenophobia, because xenophobia assumes a political, ideological position by the native to chase away the so-called the foreigner, right? And of course, this debate is no longer only in the classroom in South African universities now. We can see as well now it's arising in the legislature, in parliament, and the parliamentarians in South Africa are talking about it. But interestingly, Prof, there has been this laziness, particularly among the African intelligentsia, the professors, the scholars, to engage with this question as to what are its fundamental challenges. Why there's this question? Where does it emerge from?
Thank you, Chumani. Let's let Bob briefly respond to that. I know we've run out of time now. Bob, could you try to summarize that according to your analysis?
No, thanks very much, Mani, and we can continue engaging beyond this. But since I have to summarize this, I would say it's true that there are levels of Afrophobia most pronounced in South Africa, and it's taking various levels. I think we can talk of xenophobia at people-to-people, community level. So if you are in South Africa and you're in a township such as Soweto, you are likely to encounter Afrophobia much more than someone who is at, say, a university such as mine, which is or in a middle class or upper class, whatever. However, increasingly that is now figuring out even in corporate South Africa. South Africa used to have lots of foreigners working as technocrats and so forth. That's no longer the case. And I think we've seen that also appear in parliament, meaning that it's going towards legislation and so forth. So in conceptual terms, we can talk of Afrophobia at various levels, the lower levels, middle class, the corporate world, and quite frighteningly, it's also now figuring in institutions of higher learning. But let me just add my final point. Sometimes I think we forget that there's a form of Afrophobia in almost or many other African countries. As I mentioned earlier, if you go to many universities in Zimbabwe, in Nigeria, perhaps Ghana is slightly different, in Kenya and so forth. In the past, we used to have scholars from other African countries, but increasingly, under the pretext of the jobs must be for our people, not for foreigners, universities now have become very insular, very isolationist, and so forth. So while it is prominent in South Africa, it behoves us to look at University of Zambia and say, how many professors in this university, or University of Dar es Salaam for that matter, or any other university, what's the ratio of international students, international faculty, and so forth, as it is in other universities? And finally, Agnes, I can see you want me to conclude. I think this is one of the metrics for ranking for many universities at, internationalizations. To what extent is your institution a global institution? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bob. That was very thoughtful, analytical, and realistic, trying to actually, these are things that we can relate to, looking at the education system everywhere else, including the United States. Thank you for those presentations. And, we have in the chat, people who've agreed with you, Bob. If you can look at that, there are lots of comments, positive comments related to your presentation. And again, thank you so much for coming through and for your very well thought and well-rounded presentation.